right, thank you for the intro. I hope you have some data nerds in the crowd this morning. Any metaverse fans? Wow, that's 2 more than we got last time. Good stuff. So, I'm Josh Lustgarten. I head revenue at TextNow, and we're the largest free phone service in the US. My group sells the advertising that keeps it free. I am joined by Craig Elimeliah. He is the Chief Experience Design Officer at VLMY&R. Craig is tasked with customer experience for the agency's clients, orchestrating the end-to-end customer journey. I asked Craig, what does that mean when we spoke last, because I didn't really get it. And he does some really interesting and cool stuff. So Craig, what does that mean?
What does what mean? Yeah, I think for us, we are probably the largest entity within WPP, and we really focus on end-to-end journey being both the brand experience and the customer experience, and really bringing those things closer together. I think the industry has sort of become kind of bifurcated in terms of brand being way over here, awareness and post-purchase stuff kind of being way over here. And I'm sort of obsessed with like bringing those two things together. And that's really our special sauce. That's what we bring to our clients. So we really allow them to kind of orchestrate across the entire consumer spectrum, as opposed to kind of breaking things apart and trying to figure out how to put it back together.
Both are fun sometimes.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So over the next 30 or so minutes, we'll talk about identity, how identity translates to the metaverse, and how marketers now need to be more customer-centric, more than ever, if they're really trying to draw the customer in. So coming from the sales side, always nice to talk to someone on the creative side. You always give it a different lens. So when we first started talking about identity, you said that people have multiple ways to identify themselves. In this room, you probably see the two of us up here and you say, you're a creative, you're on the sales side. To the marketer who sees us online, you probably have our phone number, you have our email, you have our device IDs on our phones. That's how TextNow identifies a lot of people, right? And so the marketer thinks they know certain things, but only because of the identity that they have. But in actuality, we are very, very different people at very different times, right? So the conversation we have at work will be very different than the conversation we have out with friends or with our children, right? So you actually spoke about that, and I would love to hear you said a customer has a couple phone numbers. You engage differently on TikTok versus LinkedIn. So
sure.
Let's hear more about that.
First of all, metaverse is just clickbait, right? Everyone loves to hear the word. It's, for me, metaverse really is just kind of the buzzword for the next phase of the internet. And the next phase of the internet really is about giving more autonomy to the consumer. Right? The consumer is owning their own data. They're owning their own customer profile. They're owning how they show up to brands, right? How they show up to any sort of given instance of anything, right? So a person may show up on TikTok as, a 15-year-old two-headed dragon that breathes fire and likes to do like twerky dances. And then they may show up on LinkedIn as a very well buttoned up professional that is very focused on their career and very focused on, furthering that career through their, through their own personal brand. Right. Mm-hmm. And I think as marketers, we really have to start recognizing the fact that our consumers are different people at different times, different places, and want to be addressed as such. And I think as we're moving forward and as we're creating more immersive experiences, as the metaverse allows us to surround people with experiences, not just physical, not just digital, but sort of an amalgamation of all of that, we're going to we can't ignore the fact that those people are going to show up as different entities other than what we think they are, right? So you may think I am a 40-year-old white guy that has 2 kids and lives in this, like.
You fooled us.
Well, when I engage, Nike online, mm-hmm. I'm an aspiring athlete that really wishes I could slam dunk, that's who I am, right? So engage me as such, and so the idea that, again, the metaverse is offering us this sort of spectrum of identity and the ability to be engaged with on our terms, not on the brand's terms.
Okay. So this sounds a lot easier said than done. What are some brands, or if you can give a good example of a brand that is currently doing this, maybe a brand at the forefront right now. Right. The two of us spoke about T-Mobile, who's a client of yours. So let's maybe go with someone from your client side and then a brand that you admire from afar.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know too many brands doing it at the moment. I'm starting to see things happening in real time. Nike just released a new platform called .swoosh that essentially is allowing customers to have their own domains and giving them the ability to not only buy into the brand in the form of digital assets, but also sell those assets and use those assets sort of interoperably around the internet. Don't know what that's going to look like yet, but sounds cool. Like, it sounds like they understand where things are going. So there's a lot of signals. I oversee our T-Mobile client and relationship, and as a carrier, you can imagine T-Mobile kind of being sort of the arbiter of identity. Because right now, like, our phone numbers are essentially like our ID numbers, right? Like, that's sort of the primary way we track people. I call you, whether my name shows up or my number shows up, like, it's all sort of triangulated around there. So some of the conversations I'm having with my client is like, what is the role of a carrier in this next phase of the internet? Like, how can we be more helpful? How can we be, how can we enable our customers to be able to use their identity in more interesting ways? And how can we allow them to understand the value exchange between brands? You want my data? Cool. What do I get? What are you going to give me in return? Right now, we're sort of just like sucking up data and sort of taking advantage of people. No ill intent, but again, like, it's kind of a one-way street. But I think now once that power is in the hands of the consumer, how does that relationship start to look? Yeah.
So this is the second time this group has discussed the value exchange. I heard the prior session talk about it. Glad it was brought up again with us. That's my favorite thing. I feel like that's what TextNow is based on. We give free phone service in exchange for you to see ads, right? Pretty simple value exchange. And so when we started working with marketers, the first marketer that we wanted to test this hypothesis with, it was if, same thing you just mentioned, if a marketer gives the consumer something that they want, the consumer is more willing to do a call to action that they want. And so we tested this with McDonald's. And McDonald's said, if you download our app and you enter your information, give us your first party data, we'll give you a free large fries. That's all it took. And we got millions of our customers to actually download the McDonald's app and to enter their information. And we were all kind of scratching our head. Like, it takes 99 cents. That's it, right? So how do marketers really lean into this value exchange? And I'm totally with you. I think that is the future, right? It's the marketer needs to give them the consumer, and the consumer is more than happy to accommodate their call to action. So I'd love to hear how you guide your clients to this and how you are thinking about this.
Yeah, well, I think it's tricky, right? So if we're going to already start to recognize that people are different entities, or let's just say there's this spectrum of identity out there that we need to start to track, right? And it becomes a much more dynamic environment where you might not be you at that particular moment, right? Like, what if you don't like French fries, right? Like, what about all the people who don't eat French fries? Like, what about all the people who are watching their weight, or, I don't know, allergic to salt, whatever, right? So again, I think the value exchange has to be customer led, right? Like, I think you have to think about, like, what do people want in exchange for what I want from them as a brand, and how much are they willing to give in order to transact, right? So, I think about transactions as two different things, right? Like, it's time saved and time spent, right? You're either getting people to spend time with your brand, right? Hang out, do all kinds of cool stuff, or save them time. I don't want to wait online. I want to get quick. Like, think about like Disney. Disney's like the perfect example. Time spent, you're there, you're immersed, but also like they give you this little band and you can cut the line, right? Like, there's a beautiful sort of balance there. So I think we really have to think about how much are we asking people to spend with us, and how much are we willing to save for them.
So for spend, it's not just monetary.
Oh, totally.
Right? It's
totally.
Is what are you willing to give in return.
Exactly. And I do think as we're moving forward, we're going to start actually seeing it become a little bit more monetary. I do, we sort of saw this kind of wave last year or the past 2 years of, NFTs and people buying digital assets. And I think that, it's correcting itself right now, but I do think that we're eventually going to see people buying into brands the same way they are buying stock into companies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So people will be investing in brands in a way that will return them access and utility and all kinds of interesting things, but the brand has to give them something in return for that money, as well. Yeah.
Okay, so before we get into the specifics of the metaverse, this wasn't planned, but you mentioned NFTs.
Yeah.
I feel like that term and that popularity kind of died out over the last couple of months.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the NFT space?
Look at the crypto market. I mean, it's highly volatile. It's also extremely exciting. I think like the potentiality for brands and consumers to actually have this partnership is really interesting. We're seeing brands, we're seeing some brands do it really well. I mean, Starbucks, I think their new loyalty program that's essentially based on blockchain and crypto, I think it's great, right? But again, and then we just saw yesterday that the US is doing like a 16-month digital dollar kind of testing. So we're getting there. I think it was the pandemic. We were bored. We were at home. We didn't have anything to buy. We bought NFT. Like we saw sort of like this spike, and I feel like we're sort of in a correction kind of period right now. But I do think the idea that people buying into digital assets and those assets having value and having the ability to and having interoperability across many different branded experiences is not only a cool concept. I think it's the future. I think it's the future of the internet. Yeah.
Awesome. Future of internet. We're going to talk a bit about more of that. You also mentioned something else that's pretty interesting. You mentioned what a brand cares about. The brand, and there's a lot of brand marketers here, right? So the brand wants to measure how much time are you spending on my website? How much time are you spending with my content? How much time are you spending with me? The consumer wants the opposite. The consumer is saying, how do you save me time? How do you save me money? How do I get in and how do I get out, right? And so you have these two different objectives. How do you walk that fine line?
That's the beauty, there's beauty in tension, right? And, like any great story, you have Jedi and Sith, and like, that's the beauty, that's the tension as at least as a creative or as a strategic sort of marketer that I look for, in a brand. Like for me, when you don't have the tension between like, I want to spend time with you, I want to hang out, I want to consume, I also need you to not make me, and I kind of liken it to, you think about the past few years, and I hope no one here is from the brand, but you think about like past few years, like Burger King has been like winning awards left and right for all their marketing. It's been moldy Whoppers and all kinds of. Have you ever walked into a Burger King? It's kind of like a horrible experience. It's not the greatest thing in the entire world.
The king doesn't greet you anymore.
The king doesn't greet you anymore. And, when you talk about a brand promise that says your way, that's a big promise. And then you walk into this place and it's dirty and it's this and so you think about those two things. I think it goes back to that, what I had originally said, the brand experience and the customer experience have to have a balance. It has to be sort of a symbiotic relationship. And, as marketers, I think, I see people spending on brand, right, and building brand, but how many are spending on the experience? How many are really thinking about how quickly can people get in and out of my website? How quickly can people, transact? And the benchmark is quite high. And, brands often benchmark themselves against their competition, but they actually should be best benchmarking themselves against, their customer's last best experience, right? So if I take an Uber to your store and, I click a button and a magic carpet comes and picks me up and I get in and I get out, it's a beautiful experience, seamless. And then I walk into your store and I can't pay with my phone. That's like, what? Like, where did this break, right? So, to your question, I think like there's a continuum that is outside of the brand. And the brand sort of has to think about like, what was my customer's last best experience? And how am I setting the expectation for their next best experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think that tension lies. And that tension is what we use to, to sort of make sure that everything across the entire spectrum feels consistent from the promise to the delivery.
Yeah. What's funny, like most folks, I use Uber, I use Lyft. Had a horrible experience with Uber maybe a year and a half ago, right? Where I was in the airport, it was pouring rain, so it was impossible to get a cab. And I called my Uber, and someone else got into my Uber and drove away, and he didn't answer his phone. So I'm just standing there. And then all I wanted when I reached out to customer service was just for them to make it right. And they just said, "Sorry, you had a bad experience. Bye." I used Lyft for 6 straight months exclusively after that. And it took surge pricing from Lyft to get me back into Uber, but right? And so it's the brand experience where I'm like, I expect more from Uber.
Right. So that's a great example where Uber has an off the charts customer experience, meaning using the app and using the service. But when something goes wrong, right, like they're not really sort of like addressing it in any sort of way, shape, or form. And we see that a lot with a lot of those sort of digital brands, right? Like, who do you call at Amazon, right? Like, does Apple have a phone number? They don't, right? Like, you just sort of expect it to work. And when it doesn't work, you get disappointed. But the product is so good, you end up going back.
Of course. Yeah. Okay. That's identity. That's brands. That's the consumer experience. Let's get into the metaverse. So I ask this question, and I get a different answer every single time. What is the metaverse to you? And what is the purpose of it?
So I'll start with what it isn't. It's not Fortnite. It's not Decentraland. It's not, Sandbox where there's 6 people hanging out. I don't know what they're doing there. To me, it really is a marketing term. The metaverse is a marketing term, right? Like, we're all marketers. We all need a common language. We all need a term that we can coalesce around in order to like point at something that we know is coming, but we're not quite sure what it is, right? And that's what the metaverse is, right? The metaverse is like the evolution of immersive experiences. That's why when we look at Fortnite, we're like, oh, it's that. It's not that, but maybe, it's not VR, right? Like, VR is actually the opposite of the metaverse, because the VR is sort of like taking you out of the world. And I think the metaverse is really more immersive from a community perspective. And you should feel like you're here together in this room. Whenever I see, I'm not sure if it's Facebook, whoever runs this spot, but like, to see this commercial where there are people around the table and they're all wearing headsets. And I'm just like, why would anyone want to do that? But I do think to get very fundamental, it's identity, the evolution of identity, and identity being owned by the consumer. I think it's interoperability, the idea that the consumer, a consumer-led experience is less like what we're seeing right now, where everything is very compartmentalized, and more like their closet. When you open up your closet, your clothes are not, by brand, right? Like, you have all kinds of things in your closet. That's how people live. People, like, they exist in the world with many different brands all around them. And I think that the idea of an interoperable brand, a brand that has the awareness that its customers are interacting with other brands, is mature and sophisticated, and where I think we're going to be. So, like, the idea of interoperability, and community. I think the idea of community, and not just community in the sense of like, I'm a brand, I'm going to build a community, and I'm going to like dangle a carrot and get a bunch of people to come here, and then I'm going to try to get them to do a thing. No, I think community is built on the community. Communities build communities, right? And, you think about segments and subsegments and sub-segments, and we see it every single day, and we scratch our heads, and our clients, at least my clients, are like, how do we talk to everyone? If we're talking to everyone, we're talking to no one, right? Like, that's the challenge, right? So those are sort of the three, I think, pillars of the metaverse that are going to really challenge us as an industry to start figuring out how we're sort of using our ad tech and our creativity and our dollars to be able to address a world that looks very different than the world that we live in right now.
Yeah. So I was at the ANA the other week, and a senior executive at Meta gave a keynote about the metaverse. And they said, my boss will kill me if he heard me say this, but I think we are at least 10 years away from widespread adoption for both consumers and brands, right? And so do you actually think we're that far?
I don't think we're that far. Again, I think it's incremental. We're going to take small steps, and you know why I feel like this is such an exciting time. You know, I was a kid when the internet kind of got going, and I was very fortunate to be a very early kind of creator in that world, and I was able to push the boundaries of the internet for brands. So like the first things I did, I was, you know, no one knew what the internet was. So I had brands like BMW and AT&T and there was no playbook, right? Like I could pretty much do anything I wanted, right? So I think we're kind of back to that sort of like, it's going to go as fast as we make it, right? And I think you're going to have brands that will push, and you'll have brands that'll, like Nike's kind of doing it right now. They're saying like, screw NFTs. We don't care that it's down. We're going to keep going. We're going to keep kind of doubling down on that investment. And it's working. Like people, they're making it simpler and simpler for people to understand. I think the enablement, the underpinning, the tech is becoming a little bit more widespread. So again, I think it's going to, I don't think it's going to be 10 years, but I think it's going to go as fast as we decide to push it. And again, I think consumers are going to play a much larger role in this than they did in the internet because they grew up digital. They were born digital. Everyone's got one of these, or
at least one
of these, right? And I don't think it's gonna be 10 years, but I do think that it's gonna take a while for brands to figure things out. And as they do, we'll sort of inch our way and figure out, like, you know, the picture will start becoming clearer and clearer as we move along. Yeah.
So it will become clearer, I think, for a brand marketer and for consumers. But I think what's about to be really hard, and the two of us spoke about this, is how does your identity, how does your data, how does all of that transition into the metaverse, right? Because people have numerous identities. And when you go to something, let's call it a virtual type of experience, you don't have to be who you are right here, right? I kind of go back to thinking about when I built my first avatar. Many moons back, it didn't look exactly like me. I threw a fun mustache on and did all these other different things. So when consumers go into the metaverse, how are brands actually able to track their identity because they are who they want to be at that given time?
That's the fun part. You know, I think brands are going to have to create experiences in which consumers can lean into authentically and feel like they can be their true selves at that moment, right? And you know, that can take many, many different shapes. I think some of the more successful executions that we see are those in which we allow our consumers to sort of self-select or like sort of, you know, kind of write their own script, right? And kind of do it the way they want to do it and sort of allow them to lead. And I think that's the mindset we're just going to have to adopt. Like, how do we let our customers lead? How do we allow them to engage with us on their terms, right? And I think we're going to see so much more value in that because, you know, when you force someone to engage on your terms, you know, there's friction. But when you're saying like, you're welcome into my home and you're here to be your true self, show up however you like and I'll accommodate that. Think about, forget the, think about the scope of data, right? That we will get from that particular person, right? Like we're going to know like who they are and what they like and how they feel in that moment, right? And that will change as well, right? Like we see the news cycle, you know, last night, Trump made an announcement, everything shifts, right? Like, you know, the idea that a person, the idea that also like culture affects people, right? So like I may be here right now, but like there's a big culture shift. I'm not the same person. My views have changed, or I'm struggling, or I'm trying to figure it out. So again, I think brands need to be able to start to create spaces with a consumer-led mindset that's going to allow them to show up with the identity, or at least give them the fluidity that they want and need in order to transact in that particular moment. Yeah.
That sounds like a very big lift and challenging time for marketers ahead.
It is. But it's the fun part. It's kind of therein lies the creativity, right? The creativity is how do we embrace our consumers for who they are, and how do we create an environment that is inclusive? How do we create an environment that is accessible? How do we create an environment that gives them the ability to be who they want to be in this particular moment? I mean, think about luxury brands, right? Like luxury brands create this, and that's why I think luxury brands have sort of adopted the metaverse or the narrative of metaverse first. Think about the worlds they create, right? Like a luxury brand literally is about you feeling heightened, elevated, right? Like that's the secret sauce, right? Like so imagine that happening across all brands, and it's not a matter, and at different sort of frequencies, right? That's fun. That's great.
That's very fun. Yeah. Okay. I think we have time for one or two more questions here, and then we could open it up to the floor if anyone has questions there. So we both work for mobile carriers, right? What is the role of the carrier in the metaverse?
I said it before. I think, and I guess I'm kind of giving this away a little bit, but I do think identity. I think the idea that this is sort of the key that unlocks the doors of all the places we go to and interact with, and the idea that this is not just the screen, but what it unlocks around the screen and how it allows us to interact with things around us. Again, I'm showing up as me. Like, so how do I carry that identity with me? How do I show up as my true self, or however I choose to show up at that given moment? I think the carrier, which up until now has been primarily invisible, right? Like, will have a much more prominent role in how I'm able to manage all of the different sort of identities that I carry with me. So I could be wrong, but that's kind of where my gut's taking me right now. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Why don't we open up for a couple questions? Because I know when the two of us started talking, I had lots of questions about the metaverse. You helped guide me, and you helped guide this conversation.
This has been an awesome conversation. Really super, super interesting. So interesting that the big man himself, the chief content officer, has a question that he'd like to ask.
Well, yeah. Hey, everybody. David, brand Innovators. Thank you guys for doing this. Really awesome. Love it. Learned a lot. I had a couple things. So first of all, I know we disagree on Twitter, but and what's happening these days. But I love kind of your point about the metaverse being more of a label that is helpful for us in the industry. When we talk to marketers, I liken it a lot to e-commerce, right? We all shopped in the real world. Then we shopped online when new technologies enabled it. But if I'm going on Amazon, I'm buying something, I'm not going to say like, hey, I did an e-commerce today, right? Like that's something that we say and use because it's helpful to differentiate. But for the actual consumer, it's no, this is just a natural evolution of behaviors enabled by new technologies. It may be similar for the metaverse. But I want to go back to something, and I only caught the tail end of it, but you were talking about applying these technologies in a way that brands could really foster more loyalty through ownership, which is something that I think is really fascinating. There was a startup I covered years ago when I was at Ad Age called Loyal3 that tried to do that by enabling like fractional micro shares of stock purchases. So like Coca-Cola, I think, was an early user. I mean, the startup is defunct, but the idea being that, oh, if I can help somebody get a fractional share of my company, and most people being like 80% of the population not owning real stocks investments, like then maybe they would feel a stake in the company and be more inclined to support us if they feel like an owner. How do you see these technologies? I mean, like, 'cause, I don't want to necessarily put you on the spot, but are there applications of these technologies that you think could help enable that type of sentiment among consumers?
Absolutely. And I love where you're going with that. The idea of share in the company, I think is sort of the right way to think about it. But I kind of want to shift it to more like sharing culture, right? And how that company is sort of playing a part in culture, right? So when you think about Nike's a great example, right? They bought RFTK. They bought this really hot NFT studio because they understood that they needed to start creating assets that were very similar to the kinds of assets they were creating, right? And the idea that you bought into a campaign or you bought into an experience, you have more skin in the game, right? And I think up until now, we've sort of bought into those experiences with our time. And what happens is we kind of walk away from them feeling empty because we don't really, it's like, that was cool, right? Like, that was cool. Now what? You know, like I don't really have anything to show for it. But I think when you're able to now be part of a cultural kind of happening, and you think about, like, I'll use a really nerdy internet word, but like you think about like a DAO, right? Like, and things like that. So you're now part of a community that's responsible for a cultural shift or a cultural thing. And you can prove that you are part of it, right? You have a souvenir, you have some sort of thing that not only can you walk away with, but the brand actually enables you to like do other things with too, right? Like, so it opens up exclusive access. It opens up, the ability to maybe cut the line, or whatever it may be, like, right? Like, so the idea of buying into a brand, I think, is really like, and giving consumers the ability to have true stake in the game and own that thing and actually even be able to sell it is really kind of cool. You know, I can't like think about like up until now, people will be like, oh yeah, I was at the opening of the Nike thing and I got the thing. And what if you could like sell that access to somebody else, right? Like all of a sudden there's this cultural currency that brands are now able to play with and consumers seem to want, right? Like, think about drop culture and brands like Supreme and whatnot, right? Like we're seeing it happening. Similar concept is collabs, right? Like when I talk about the idea of interoperability, we love collabs because we see two worlds coming together that we didn't expect, and it's cool, right? Imagine the entire world being like that, right? Like imagine like any brand being able to interact with any other brand. We like that because that's what we do. Right? Like I'm wearing Doc Martens and I'm wearing, I don't know, Levi jeans. I can't shop in that fact, like, right? I want to be able to interact with those two brands at the same time. That's true interoperability. When it happens, it's amazing. I'll stand online for hours to experience that, but it never happens, right? Like, so these are sort of the ideas of the metaverse that I think that we should start to expect to, and technology's not there. We need enablers, we need the underpinning, we need the infrastructure, but the ideas are there. I think the ideas exist.